Why do I need so many passwords? Hey, I am Chuck the bureaucrat, and I recently, unexpectedly, fell down a rabbit hole into the bizarre world of government authentication for their websites. And look, I go down a lot of rabbit holes because that's where rabbits try to hide from bureaucrats like me, but this one was downright weird. Okay, as you approach your military transition or retirement, you're going to notice that there are a whole bunch of different ways to authenticate your identity. You got DS Login and login.gov, and then there's IDMe, that's an interesting one. And it seems like the VA is creating a new one called My Healthy Vet. See the cute little E? They have been there the whole time, but as long as you had a common access card, you didn't need to use them. In fact, what that means is that in a lot of cases, you don't actually need a military CAC. Government civilian or a contractor with a CAC card can get done what they need to do without using these alternate login techniques. That should be the biggest hint about what all these authentication methods are really for. They exist so that federal agencies can authenticate the identity of certain parts of the American population who are eligible for their services. So let's take a look at this from the perspective of which federal agencies use which method of authentication and what population is eligible for those services. First one you probably already have in your pocket, and that is a CAC card. These are used by the Department of Defense to identify active duty military, most reservists, your civilian employees, including GS and SES, and then eligible contractors. Next, you got DS Login, and that is an authentication technique managed by the Department of Defense. In fact, it's created by the Defense Manpower Data Center, DMDC. Essentially, anybody who has ever been issued a CAC can get a DS Login. That includes service members, active and reserve, veterans, retirees, spouses, even former spouses if they're beneficiaries, eligible children, contractors, and civilians. DS Login is primarily used by DoD and VA websites that provide benefits to retirees and veterans. Similar to DS Login, there is login.gov. This is another self-service authentication, with username and password and two-factor authentication. And it's used by USA Jobs for federal employment, the Department of Homeland Security for the Trusted Traveler Program, and then the Small Business Administration. And the Department of Defense uses it when the information being accessed is intended for the public. Anybody who's willing to submit the personally identifiable information, PII, that's necessary to verify that they are who they claim they are, can get a login.gov account. Now, at the same time, the Department of Veterans Affairs seems to be launching their own authentication method called My Healthy Vet. It's not 100% obvious to me why DS Login isn't adequate for their needs, but I get the sense that they're trying to exclude people who would qualify for DS Login but don't qualify for veterans benefits, like some government civilians and contractors. Finally, there is an authentication tool called IDMe that is used by the IRS, Social Security, and a whole bunch of state agencies. As you can imagine from the federal agencies I just listed, IDMe is for just about anybody who has a Social Security number and pays taxes. This is the part where it starts to get weird. IDMe is just a company selling online identification verification. But their CEO, Blake Hall, he is a military veteran. He was an Army Ranger, and every time he gets interviewed, he makes it really clear that he has an Army background. And then, when you go to the IDMe website, you get smacked in the face with these really crass sales pitches. And that is because IDMe started its life on the internet as a Craigslist knockoff. And then it tried to recreate itself as a Groupon clone. For some reason, we're trusting this guy with verifying our identity, and I can't imagine what could possibly go wrong. But back to why this matters for you. Well, you've probably noticed from this rundown that if you're going to access the full suite of all your benefits and your retirement planning, you're going to need all of these authenticators. So I would recommend that you keep them close to one another. And second, be prepared for this situation to get worse before it gets better. Rational American would think that the federal government only needed one authentication method to manage its population. But let's face it, there's money to be made, so that means that there is going to be all sorts of competition to get their hands on those resources. And like every good bureaucratic tale, Congress and the president are going to be issuing law and policy that, in their own way, will stimulate this feeding frenzy. For example, you remember the VA's My Healthy Vet? Part of the justification that the Veterans Administration uses for creating that new authentication comes from Executive Order 14028, Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity. That was signed by President Biden back in May of 2021. And since improving our nation's cybersecurity is the kind of thing that every politician can get behind, I would expect that we would see changes to policy every couple of years. Want to see something else that I think is going to change? Watch this video to see how the federal fiscal year has shifted over time and why I think it's about to change again.